I'm here with Dr. Linda Holloway, a professor at Alabama State University with over 30 years of teaching experience. With over 30 years of teaching experience, she wanted to develop books that we use to help counselors, social workers, mental health professionals, teachers, administrators, families, churches, and funeral homes discuss with children the concept of loss. When we think of divorce, we do not always think of loss in the same way we think of loss when it comes to death. However, with both of these events, children experience an incredible amount of grief. Dr. Holloway, welcome back. Thank you so much for coming back.
Hello, Ron. Thank you so much for having me back. It's such a pleasure to have me back, and I truly, truly appreciate it. And I also want to just say thank you for the work that you're doing, and thank you for the many listeners that will have the opportunity to hear this program.
Of course. And I think, your books are like really important. And we talked about in the last interview, we left off like, we didn't really get to talk about, you know, why did you decide to write like, these books on specific, like those two topics, loss and divorce and death, which are heavy topics for children?
Okay. Thank you so much for that question. Actually, I have eight children books and there are eight award-winning children books. So I want to talk from that perspective. I know you're just focusing in on the divorce and the death, which are my last two books,
Right.
but my books were derived from articles that I had written. So
Okay.
in having written those particular articles about various topics, for example, I wrote an article on Black women here in the marketplace. So I'm actually talking to adults and you start to think about like who actually read your articles that are published in journals. And so there's a certain population. So in order to reach young children and the population that I wanted to reach, and also to have an impact on literacy and social emotional learning, that's motivated me to want to write the book. Because even in talking to the women about whether it was about their hair, mental health, sickle cell, or any of the topics that I've written about, I realized that they were once young children. So I was like, how can I reach children? So I decided the best way to do that would be have a children book that would allow to do that. And I don't just think of my books as children books because, and what I mean by that is they're teachable. They are books that are actually designed to educate, empower, and explain to children about various things. So you will find throughout all of my various books, there are what I call LOLs, and they are learning out loud. So there are questions not only just pertaining to the book, but they may be about the various topics that I'm writing about. I also did scavenger hunt so they get to find different things. So I tried to make it as interesting as possible because, as you mentioned, these are pretty heavy topics to be talking to children about, and they can be very triggering.
Most definitely. And they're important topics though to discuss because these are things that occur in life and you have to have a way like, to explain them to children, especially like, when we see that the divorce rate is so high and then death happens to us all. We never know like, when our time on this earth is going to come. And you have the books, Little Miss Linda copes with divorce and then Little Miss Linda speaks out about death. Can you talk about like, how you developed the character Little Miss Linda and the process of writing these books?
Okay, the process is very similar, obviously, to why I was motivated to actually put the book out, but was being able to take the character. So I consider Little Miss Linda to be my childlike voice, if you would. And many things about Little Miss Linda, about who I am, are actually included in the book. For example, you mentioned the divorce. My parents were married for over 40 something years. So you'll see sprinkles of truth throughout the book, but they are fictional books. So they are not based upon true story. But and having that 40 years of telling about my parents, that was an opportunity to include that in the book and actually be able to identify with it. So, and that helps me to develop the character. And also, obviously, it takes place in Mount Bayou, Mississippi. I might include the total number of siblings that I have and things of that nature. And having been an adult child of a divorce and understanding how that what that would mean to a person having to go through that. So that's kind of like how I developed the character. And obviously, as I mentioned before, the topics are based upon various articles that I wrote. But when you, like you mentioned, And it's been proven that, 50% of the people that get married end up getting a divorce. And that number sometimes obviously can be higher. So being able to talk about in a childlike way, in a way that can be understandable, because the parents are going through a loss, but also that child is going through a loss, trying to not blame themselves, trying to recreate what a new family would look like. And so being able to have something, a tool in which counselors and mental health providers can use to actually help them with children to navigate that in the counseling process. And the same way with death. We talk about death, but also the grieving process. If you think about it, our country has gone through, massive death that children have been exposed to. If you think about 9/11, many of the schools have TVs in the room, so they actually watch this. And
Right.
so they're very aware of what it is to deal with loss, but being able to have, once again, a book, a children book, or something they can talk to and to help them process that can be very, very helpful. Because like I said, we was a country that was at war for a very long time, and we came out of COVID. There's numerous of children lost, grandparents, parents, they knew of someone that they had lost to COVID. So how do you talk to children about what that really means? Because many of them did not get a chance to go to the hospital. Many of them did not get a chance to say goodbye. And obviously, depending on a person's culture, what their beliefs is, and being able to help that child to cope through that grieving process and what death means to them. It's going to vary depending on what their belief system is and what they think that a child can actually handle. But oftentimes, children understand that, from their cognitive perspective, that something has happened. This person is not going to ever be here anymore. So to make up like a story like, oh, she's just sleeping. Now the child is afraid to go to sleep because it's like, well, Nana laid down and went to sleep and she died. I don't want to lay down and go to sleep and die. So being able to have a healthy conversation around what that means and that process, and being able to honor that person and in terms of that, or maybe even just talk about, you had a plant that died. This is what happens to the plant and things of that nature. So I think it's extremely important to have these conversations because what we see going on in the world today.
Most definitely. And you raise up like, some interesting points, because there is a lot of death in this country. I think about like, school shootings, and you mentioned like, the 9/11, and little Miss Linda copes with divorce. I thought like, one of the interesting things is that you have a "We love you" jar. Her parents do when they decided they're getting a divorce, where little Miss Linda, she gets to put any questions she might have in the jar for her parents to provide answers to. And then in the death book about little Miss Linda, it tells her being told by her mother she only has 7 months to live and decides to create a memorable moments together. Can you talk about like, the idea for those stories? Because those are beautiful, a beautiful way to explain it to children.
Once again, because these are very challenging topics to talk about, I wanted the children as well as the educators and people to walk away with something that they tangible that they can actually do. So you talk about the developed book in terms of "We love you" job, because oftentimes the children feel like it is my fault why my parents are getting divorced, and they blame themselves. And so they have a lot of questions. So being able to have those questions and have an open conversation about those questions is very important. To have the child to write what the questions are, like, where am I going to live? I'm used to both of my parents coming to the PTA meet. What is that going to look like for me? And things like that. So being able to have those questions answered in the best way they can answer them at that time. And maybe obviously in the book, they sit down and they answer those questions, but also maybe they could be questions that they can answer later on. They may not be, able to answer them in that very fragile moment at the time. Because a lot of times people say, oh, that's like a fairy tale. When I was going through a divorce, it was really hard. We weren't talking, we weren't even thinking about co-parenting. I'm just trying to help myself, and things like that. And oftentimes the child do get left out. So you may not be able to create that moment at that time, but maybe at another time that you can do that. So that's where that comes from, the "We love you" job, so that they can have those questions. Even in the divorce, the mother takes the opportunity to explain it like a season of life. And she was just explaining to her that there's the fall season, there's the winter season, and during these seasons of life, that life changes, you know. And so she was able to try to explain that as much to Linda as possible. And then when you get into the deaf book, her mother does create these various things that she wants to leave behind because she's only told she has a limited time to live. And so these were things that she had the opportunity to do. And that was create a scrapbook, which was memorable things that her and little Miss Linda did together, whether it was going to have ice cream, going to a movie, just driving around in the park. And because she wanted Linda to have these things once she has made her transition. And then also little Miss Linda could also ask questions. And then she also created a I am grateful jar because she said there's going to be moments that's going to be really, really hard for you when I'm no longer here. But I want you to think of the things that you are grateful for. And one of the things that little Miss Linda does in all of her books is that there is something that she is going through that maybe seem like a tragic, but she triumphs it and make it into something positive. So she goes on the road to teach other people that these are things that she found helpful and they also can do those things also.
Yeah, that's really powerful. And I love like, the way that you've made the books interactive and lighthearted as possible. Could you talk about the challenge of, making it digestible? Because as we've discussed previously, these are weighty topics, and then children, but it's still like I feel has a lot of lightness to it. How difficult was that?
It was not because of for my level in terms of creativity. A lot of times, like even when I'm in the classroom, I try to do the same thing.
Mhm.
I try to make it where it's a situations where that I am able to like literally, talk about things that can be in a way that is creative, that also, like you said, that is digestible, that is enjoyable, and also it allows people to have a critical analysis of what's actually going on.
Um, you also included scavenger hunts in both books. That's really fun. Like, what gave you that idea?
There are books that actually have those particular things in them. So with that being said, I just kind of thought, oh man, that's a really neat idea. That's an opportunity for the parent. That's an opportunity for the child. So for example, in my sickle cell book, that was an opportunity. Maybe a child doesn't really know what a cell look like, a sickle cell. And I mean, you can tell them, but being able to go back through and find those various sickle cell that's something that would kind of actually stay with them. And so it just makes it fun. And also allows the children to kind of zero in on various things that deal with the particular things that we're talking about. Because in the counseling book, there's a situation where they look for smiley face. Obviously, when people going through depression and anxiety, they're not always smiling. And so that kind of cheers that up, if you would. And of course, when it got to the divorce book, in those books, you try to think about what can I have that person to look for. So in the divorce book, we thought to, came up with a broken heart because the child actually experienced broken heart. The parents also often experience that too. And so that was something we wanted to do. And then, of course, coming down to the death book, we used dolls. And so the children, because at some funerals, people release dolls. And so that was something that we wanted to have, just to kind of have the child to look back through and notice. And some of them kind of say things like, oh, I noticed that when I was first reading the book. And they just get really excited about trying to locate them.
Makes me think about my own life in retrospect. And, my parents were wonderful. Like, they're still married, fortunately. But
Mm-hmm.
I remember no one really explained death. It just was something that happened. It wasn't like, people like, ever really sat down and, it was just kind of like expected you to understand. And maybe like I had the concept, like I remember when my grandfather died. He was about 81 and I was a child. And they just told me he died, and I was really sad. Like I knew what death was because I was pretty advanced for my age. I think like, like from television, and I understood the concept of death and that he wasn't coming back. but no one really sat down with me to process that. And I imagine like a lot of people went through that. Why do you feel like in Western society, particularly, like we don't really talk to children and explain these situations, like, get more in depth? At least in my household, I know for some of my friends, like they probably went through the same situation. It wasn't like anything that was really discussed with us. Just we were just kind of told like, people had died.
I think there are numerous of ways, but one of my knee-jerk response would be we think that a child wouldn't understand.
Right.
And we don't want to burden that child with what we consider to be adult business. And so
Right.
I'm going to tell them what I think that will be okay at this time. But when you said you understood what death was, but was somebody there to help you process your feelings? Because one of the things I talk to my students about, when I'm working with the Black community, is that a lot of times we just push through stuff. We go through
Yeah,
stuff.
right. Yeah,
And
that's how I kind of feel, it was really very little discussion about it. And maybe like, not till like I got older, but I feel in my household, we didn't really talk about, traumatic things that happened, like, which I feel like, can be very helpful. And I didn't get into therapy until like I was much older because of the stigma of therapy. But I remember, my grandfather being sick, having emphysema, and like I knew that he would die because, we went to go see him in the hospital, and that was, just like seeing like, someone with emphysema and struggling to breathe as a child. That was, something and stuff I'm reminded of, even today. But the I think it would have been helpful to have more discussions about it. And like, even for the adults that were present, I do remember, people comforting me, but like being sorry, like, that my grandfather had died. Like, even if it was like, my uncle, I remember him saying that to me, which I thought was so odd because I was like, that it's your father. He said very stoically, like, and it makes me like, sometimes and stuff like, wonder why we don't discuss that. And I think it's something that's very common in the Black community, like, where we don't discuss our feelings. It's kind of almost looked as like,
okay, think about it. And it depends on, like when your parents are, in terms of the time frame in which they were born. I remember growing up, and a lot of times children got the opportunity to stay over other people's homes.
right.
And I would ask my mom, or, can I spend a night? And she would say, no, you can't stay. And I was like, but why? She
Yeah,
said, because I said so.
right.
But when you come out of that culture, because I say so, or you can't put a perm in your hair because I say so. So, like, you a child, I don't owe you an explanation. I'm the adult here, so that's kind of the culture that I came out of. So a lot of times this can be passed on. Why am I having to explain to a child that he or she can't have McDonald's and French fries? Because I'm just not going to give it to you. But obviously, so this can carry on in other aspects, and that's a very simplistic way. But also, you got to understand that maybe these individuals don't have the words themselves to explain what is happening, because they are not able to process, because once again they have gone through stuff and lived through stuff and pushed through stuff that they didn't take us up. They were not taking or given the opportunity to just pause and say, how do I really feel about this? It's like, I am going through a divorce. I got to find somewhere to live. I got to get, you got to change schools. I don't know if I'm going to stay in the same state. So as an adult, you're dealing with all of these issues that you may not be in that space to really sit down and say to that child, this is what's happening. Because it's just, like I said, it may not come at that time, or you may not have that capacity. And when I say come at that time, meaning you have so many other things that you're having to take care of as an adult to provide for that child. Because when you think about it, is you want to have that child in a safe place, in a place where they can be able to go to school, they are able to live. So those basic needs are taken care of and not disrupted, and they have food on the table and all those basic things. Because once again, we come out of culture that then oftentimes have that. a place to stay or food or clothes to wear, or your sibling clothes. So now we're in that space, and maybe that family that does have all of those things in place, and they are at a different socioeconomic status as well as educational level, that child may look a little different than someone else. So you're going to try to take care of those things that are what I consider to be mission essential. Not to suggest that your feelings aren't, but right now you got to tuck your feelings in,
Right.
because I'm from that culture. And if you're crying, it's like, well, what are you crying for?
Yeah.
Because I won't be able to see my father. Well, you get over that. I'm just trying to do this right now. And so I know that sounds like really basic or whatever, but a lot of people are just in survival mode when they're going through that, even with sometimes with grief, depending on how that death happened. If it was something quick, if I get a call, there's an accident, I got to go and get the body to the funeral home. So all of those things can obviously play factor, but having these tools in place and start to do what I call intervention versus, prevention. So it's like, okay, these are things that you can actually do. So maybe someone can say, I can, in the meantime, I can have them to read this, and then I can have them to process this before these things. Because like you said, all of us have an expiration date. We
Correct.
can, we can rest assured that's going to happen.
For sure. And divorce is so common, almost like, half of marriages end in divorce. And I imagine divorce in some ways is very similar to death because one of the parents, like, is likely to get custody of the child, more time with it. There are such things as 50-50 custody, but in the society we live in, the mother's looked at as the majority parent that gets custody most of the time. So how does childhood grief, play a role in impacting the development functions of children?
It plays a role because once again, we're dealing with a loss. And loss can look very differently depending on the family dynamics. Going back to the whole thing of in terms of divorce, that is a loss. I've actually had people describe divorce as a death. But they say it's worse than death because they say with death, at least I can bury the person and I know that they're gone. But with a
Right.
divorce, this person, I still got to interact with them. And
Yeah,
it's that kind of harshness because your comments, one, you live, you never really expected this to happen. People
for
don't
sure.
just, I won't say they don't, but we live in such a creative society. I was going to say, people don't just walk down the aisle thinking, there's a 50% chance I could get a divorce. And so this is but you try to plan for those things if they do happen, but that's not hopefully that's not the majority of the people motivation for getting married, that this can end up in a divorce. Just like when you get car insurance, you don't expect, but you know that it can be happen,
Happen.
but you don't get in your car and say, I can have an accident today, or this could be whatever. Just living your life in that mode. So that's the same way I feel about in terms of divorce. But obviously, there is some mental health issues around that, anxiety, depression, and like I said, the child has once lived in what we consider to be a stable environment. So just think about now that environment has been disrupted because what they knew to be their reality is no longer their reality. And the same way with the two people who came together, who may have who taken vows to death do us part, but that person once again is not dead, physically dead, but maybe the marriage has died or different things have happened that cause that relationship to deteriorate. And the adults understand that, but not necessarily the child understands that. So it disrupts what they consider to be what their vision of home. So automatically you can see where that can impact their mental health and their mental well-being. There's research out there, the children of divorce going through divorce it affects their academic performance. They're not able to perform at the level because they're experiencing those traumatic experience with their parents.
Yeah. Um, I was looking at some statistics, and youth suicide is on the rise. National surveillance data suggests that roughly 7 to 8% of adolescents attempt suicide each year, and roughly 17% report serious suicidal ideation. Roughly 157,000 individuals between the ages of 10 and 24 receive emergency medical care for intentional self-inflicted injuries. And that's a little bit, I think, older than the target group for your book. But I feel like some of these issues obviously probably start like when they're younger. Is that, would you think, would you say so?
There's definitely a possibility because once again, we talked about pushing through to get through. We're in survival mode. So then, with that being said, if I never got the chance to unpack that, I never got the chance to process that, then I'm not healed. I'm not made whole. So just think about in your physical body. If you break something, you patch it up, and you still able to use that arm or that leg. Eventually, if it continues to get trauma to it, it's going to cause more damage, right? So you was able to limp, but now you're not able to walk on it. You may have to get it amputated because it was never properly cared for, repositioned, or whatever type of medical treatment that it need to take care of. So take that same thought process to your mental health. You're just pushing through to get through, and you're not taking the time to deal with what is going on, your emotional baggage. So now you are in an overflow of not being healed. So now you're emotionally hemorrhaging because there was no approach. You may have put a bandage on it. And we say you don't look like what you've been through, but maybe I don't look like what I've been through, but you can't see behind the mask that I'm wearing. And so I'm covering up and I'm pushing through to get through, but I'm not healing through. Oh, nor am I growing through what I've gone through. Like we talk about death, being able to grow from that. Someone sitting down and said, yes, your grandfather has passed, but this is his legacy. And you say, oh man, I didn't know that about him. I want to carry this on so that his spirit, his life, and what he believed in continues. And so you know that his legacy lives on. But if you don't, you just kind of stun it in that. And that can also happen to you from a mental perspective.
Definitely. You are doing some amazing work. I am going to get all of your books for my children. I'm going to order them. I think like these books are like, really important, and I want to, talk more about them with like, serious issues. And I think like, it's important to have these conversations, and you put that on my mind. And I was really excited to learn, though, changing topics, though, that you created a curriculum study guide for Kendrick Lamar's Super Bowl halftime performance. Can you talk a little bit about that?
How exciting is that? There was a lot of buzz, a lot of things going on. And that's another area that I tend to do is create curriculums. Because what I really want is to bring it into the classroom or into the community where people can have conversations surrounding these various topics. And so I was able to look at it, and there was many things that stood out to me because I have such a passion for history, particularly African American, Black history, and then also just multicultural. And I say, no, they've done away or supposed to be doing away with DEI. And of course, what most people think about is just related to like jobs and things of that nature. But diversity is really important because you had people saying, I don't understand what's going on here. And I was like, but see, if you had somebody to explain to you at the table, then that will be made more clear. So was super excited to be able to look at that and be able to dissect that and make it digestible and have conversations around it in terms of what it means. Because one thing I've learned about art, and that is people come with their own level of education to it, their own level of experience, and their own level of exposure. And so, with that education, experience, and exposure, it's going to allow them to interpret it. And that's the beauty of art, that sometimes it's not a right or wrong, but you can look at a picture, you can look at a dynamic and say, this is what that means. Because immediately people looked and said, they focus in on the symbols. I focus in more on the themes because I am an educator. So I wanted to look at it through the lenses of mental health and from a social psychological perspective to have children to understand, or my students to understand, that this is something that Black Americans, African Americans has always done. It spoke about their struggles through poetry, through music. There was a reason why James Brown said, say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud. Not say it low, not mumble it, because there was a time in history where being Black, you could not be proud. So I want them to make the connection that this is not something new that Kendrick is doing, but he was front and center to be able to bring these issues to the forefront. So it allows us to look at the historical context of it and to also analyze and say, what are we saying here? What does this mean to us today? And how does it impact our mental health?
Right. Like, and I enjoyed his Super Bowl performance immensely. I felt it was a very important moment culturally, and how amazing, the president of the United States, Donald Trump, who many feel is xenophobic. I mean, I think there's a strong argument that he is. I don't know him personally. I feel conflicted about some of his policies. Like, I don't think, like, he's as racist as the media tries to portray him sometimes. But I think about what you were saying about DEI. What are your thoughts about one of the recurring themes that I've been hearing is that Black people weren't benefiting from DEI anyway, that it was mostly benefiting white women. I don't know, like, the statistics on that, but that's something I'm seeing reoccurring on the internet.
I'm going to stick to talking about diversity in terms of curriculum, not from a political perspective.
Right.
I think there are things that we benefit from. And so from a counselor perspective, counselor educator perspective, it's not a one size fit all. So most of the theories were white male, or they were white, very European. So if I'm coming in as a client and you saying, oh, I don't see color, and I'm having some kind of challenges, and if you're not able to see that through cultural lenses, you can misdiagnose me. So when you see Miss Apple misbehaving or Mr. Apple misbehaving, immediately you say, okay, he's special ed. Because you don't understand that for me to sit in a chair all day and just listen to you talk about something that I can't relate to, I'm not able to identify with, then I might be moving around or doing something. Or if someone says something to me, I respond back to them and you say, oh, you're talking in class. So now I'm being disrupted. And you was pointing out statistics about suicide. Black males are most likely to be suspended for school, followed by Black females, or if there's a fight, what does that mean? They playing the dozens of what that means, So all of those things, if you don't understand the cultural lens in which it is being produced, it can be very damaging. So now you have prison pipeline, you see what I'm saying? So it's very important. So let's get back to the issue here. Kendrick Lamar and the performance. So if you don't look at it through, if you're not looking at it through cultural lenses, you might misinterpret why he had Uncle Sam being a Black man.
Yeah,
Have you ever seen, you see what I'm talking about?
I, would-
Or
I
him
would, I would,
stand,
rec- I would recommend your study guide to so many people. We have about 4 minutes left, but I would recommend your study guide as a fan of hip hop. But like, even people outside the culture to get a better understanding, because you break this down so well from the oppressor, cultural humility, assimilation, all these topics you discuss, and made me think a lot deeper about the performance, things I might have even missed because there was so much symbolism and just double entendres and just like different layered meaning. I feel like that you could take a lot away from it culturally, the perspective. What made you want to do a study guide, like specifically about Kendrick Lamar and his Super Bowl performance?
I'm usually inspired by events. And if the events touch me deep down in my soul, and it stirs me and it just doesn't leave me, then I say, okay, this will be good. I know the students will be talking about it and we can learn things from it. And, just playing the game. We all know what that means. But someone else may live a life where they never had to play the game. They never had to be told they got to color in between the line. And if I do anything outside of that, then I could be considered as deviant. I could be considered as abnormal. And so those are the things that motivated me. The same way when I did the Montgomery Brawl, that was something, not because everybody was watching it, but because I am currently here in the great city of Montgomery. And I know that that is something we want to talk about. So I'm really big on bridging the classroom with what is going on in the community and what is going on with the culture. Because you got to remember, when a child walks into a classroom and get a textbook, it could be what, 5 years old, 2 years old, but it also took that person quite a bit of time to write that textbook. So they're just learning from the textbook. But how do I take what is going on in the world today and make it applicable to what I am currently studying? That's what I'm about, being relevant.
Right. And I learned from the study guide. I thought one of the most interesting things for me was you I posed a question about the origin of the crip walk. And it's something like, I've seen culturally, but I live in LA, and like I've lived in South Central, and like, I've seen people crip walk since Snoop Dogg, like so to actually understand like the meaning behind it, and how it like made its way into hip hop culture, I think is important. And I feel like that there's people though who dismiss that, like you see how people were criticizing Serena Williams for participating. What are your thoughts about that?
One of the things I do want my students to know is that, because you can go for the low hanging fruit, and low hanging fruit, okay, this is game related. But we often know in the Black community, something could be in one particular culture and we take it and do something else with it. But to know what is the origin of this, did it actually start with gang members? Because if that's where your education take you, then that's where it stopped. And that's the same thing. If you think that Black folks started in 1619, they were non-existent, then that's where your education gonna start, 1619 in Jamestown versus something further than that. If you talk about my hair being kinky and curly and nappy to make me feel bad, but don't understand that that is naturally the way my hair go, and just because it doesn't line up with what European culture say it should look like, does not make it bad hair. And so you get students to peel back, like you say, the layers of that to say, what are we saying and what does that mean? Because she, like you said, she did it one time before, she did it again. And what's compare the two difference and how she can be celebrated in that.
Definitely. We got less than a minute left. Dr. Linda J.M. Holloway, a story activist, author, coach, and professor. You can find her books online. I'll put the link in the description of the video. And also check out her Kendrick Lamar study guide. She also does a lot of other amazing things, such as write poetry from a social justice perspective. Dr. Linda Holloway, thank you so much. It was a pleasure and an honor.
It sure was. And thank you so much for having me again. I always feel like we never have enough time. So I look forward to coming back again.
Definitely. I really appreciate you for coming, and I'll definitely have you back. Like I appreciate the work you're doing. It's very important, and I will be getting like all of your books for my children. Thank you so
And
much.
thank you so much. All right, take care.
You too.